You can think of Conjugate as like another fancy way of saying training your weaknesses, which is one of the keys to all strength training. If you have questions, please feel free to email us podcast@verse.fit. Otherwise, you can comment below or just like our podcast. Welcome to the Verse Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, Shane Robert. Today, I want to talk about a question that I actually saw on Reddit, on Olympic weightlifting subreddit, that I've seen in more than one occasion in this particular subreddit. I've seen it in other subreddits related to bodybuilding, powerlifting, etc. And it's always something to the effect of like, does Conjugate work for fill in the blank? In this case, does Conjugate work for Olympic weightlifting? So before we get into the answer, I think there needs to be some background given, starting with what do you mean by Conjugate? Here in the West, particularly the United States, if someone says Conjugate, most people are going to think of Westside Barbell and Westside training. That's not exactly right. So let's take a step back and start with some definitions. What Conjugate is referring to is what's known in science as the conjugate sequence system. What this means is basically starting with a harder variation of something and working your way towards a more specific variation. So for example, if you ever start a block with something like pause squats, and then you work your way over time from those pause squats to maybe like pin squats, to then a high bar squat, to, if you're a powerlifter, full low bar competition style squats. You're following a conjugate sequence system. This could be applied to any exercise or even within a sporting context. If you were to shoot from farther away on the basketball court and work your way to the free throw line, or if you used an overweight implement in a throwing sport or something of that nature, that's all Conjugate. What Conjugate has come to be associated with, however, is what's actually known as the concurrent system of training. And what this means is you are training all aspects that there are to train, either within one training session or within one weekly microcycle. So that means that from a Western context, we're looking at your training maximum strength, maximum power, hypertrophy, endurance, all of these things either in the same training session or within the same training week. The way this breaks down is what's known as the maximal effort method, which is lifting a maximum weight or maximum resistance. The repetition method, which is lifting a submaximal weight for maximal amount of reps. So if you're a bodybuilder, you would know this as basically training to failure. There's the dynamic effort method, which is using a submaximal weight and moving it at a high velocity or explosively. This training increases rate of force development and allows you to generate force at lighter weights, which eventually will carry over to being able to generate force at heavier weights or move those heavy weights quickly. This in itself is a kind of conjugation within your training. If you are starting at a relatively light load for explosive reps and slowly over time you're increasing that up, that's kind of conjugation. And finally, you have what's known as the submaximal effort method. This would be taking a submaximal weight for reps, but not to failure. This is the kind of training that you might do, honestly, if you're an Olympic weightlifter. That's why you see so many Olympic weightlifters using 1 to 3 reps, even at something as light as like 70%. You're training movement patterns, not so much for maximum strength or hypertrophy. Some bodybuilders employ this method. If you look at the kind of training that was really popular in, say, the mid-90s to early 2000s, you'll see people like Jay Cutler using this kind of training, where it was never really taken to failure, or even maybe many of the sets that close to failure, but by the end, because of accumulated fatigue, they're still getting a benefit. So those are the 4 different methods that you could employ within a concurrent system. So Westside Barbell, which, as I said, in the West, we associate largely with this term conjugate, is really a concurrent training system that uses the conjugate sequence system within the context of its training. So for anyone not familiar, which I'm going to assume is a lot of our listeners, Westside Barbell and its founder, Louie Simmons, holds a special place within powerlifting and strength training. It's considered kind of controversial and divisive for a lot of reasons, but I also think that you cannot ignore the contributions that have been made within the context of American strength training that Louie Simmons and Westside Barbell has made. Let me give you a little bit of background on Louie and Westside. So Louie was originally an Olympic weightlifter as a young teenager, 14, 15, and he says he couldn't even squat 400 pounds and went to an Olympic weightlifting meet, and no one there looked particularly strong. He then went to what was an early powerlifting meet. This would be the early to mid 1960s when powerlifting was still a fledgling sport, and saw all these big, strong, jacked dudes and thought, this is the sport for me. So he gave up Olympic weightlifting and went to powerlifting. Now at this time, probably the most influential powerlifting gym, certainly in the United States, if not the world, was known as Westside Barbell. This gym was not the same gym that we now call Westside. This gym was in Culver City, California, and was run by a guy named Bill Peanuts West. He worked with a lot of really strong lifters, including the hammer thrower George Friend. I believe he won gold in the Olympics. And they were doing all kinds of experimenting. They were doing all kinds of experimental training over there in Culver City in their garage gym, and came up with a lot of protocols that they wrote about in Joe Weider's Muscle Builder magazine. Louie started reading these magazines and implementing a lot of their concepts, getting pretty strong in the process. However, he soon hit a wall and experienced some pretty bad injuries. Part of that led him to the creation of what we now call the reverse hyper machine. He invented this. Now, this exercise, as we know it, has been around forever. Has there been devices to use it? Probably. But he was the first one to create it on a mass scale, patent it, sell it, etc. This was in an effort to try to rehab his broken back. But as a result of hitting those walls and breaking his back and all those things, he thought, I am doing something wrong. There's got to be a better way to do this. At this same time, the Russian big weightlifting athletes were dominating the sport of weightlifting. They were setting world records. They were winning the Olympics. So Lou, I don't even know how he went about doing this, but he managed to get his hands on some Russian sports science journals and papers. Now, Lou was not a scientist. He was a construction worker who lived in Columbus, Ohio. So that's pretty impressive that he was able to get his hands on these things, and he took the time to sit down, read them, and understand them, which is no small feat. If you've ever read any of these texts, they are a lot. They are not written for a lay audience at all. They're translated, which then makes them even a little more muddled. They focus on so much minutia. These Russian texts, there's a lot to be learned, but oh my gosh, do they focus on so much stuff that seems irrelevant. If you ever read Boris Shayko, the eminent Russian powerlifting coach's book, there are pages and pages devoted to how many steps there are at the initiation of a squat, with different coaches arguing for like from 3 to 9 to 10. And it's like, well, does stepping under the bar count as one? Does lifting the bar off the pins count as one? Does stepping back, blah, 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 all these things. So they are focusing on the tiniest of details and putting it in these journals as an analysis of whether it matters to athletes. So Louie gets his hands on these and starts dissecting them and learning about these different methods of strength training, the maximum effort method, the dynamic method, the repetition method. And it seems like he probably didn't learn about or ignored the submaximal effort method. And he said, okay, I'm going to start incorporating these into my own training. He had already had a bias to the maximum effort method. The original Westside Barbell in Culver City used something that we would recognize as a maximum effort method, where they would use box squats at different heights, above parallel, at parallel, and below parallel, working up to max singles or maximum rep. So Louie was already doing this in his training and had seen great benefit. So he had a little bit of bias that was confirmed. And so he starts playing around with these different concepts and finding what worked for him and his lifters. And in the process, he got very strong. His lifters got very strong. He's based in Columbus, Ohio. He took lifters who were from Columbus. These weren't already established strong lifters, and turned many of them into world-class lifters, including his own wife, who set a number of world records in the lightweight women's categories. This led him to explore new methods of strength training, like accommodating resistance, which is to say attaching implements to the bar like bands or chains that increase the resistance as you go up in the range of motion, which helps accommodate the strength curve. And I already mentioned the reverse hyper. He innovated a lot of exercises and concepts and machines in the process of trying to figure out how to make himself and his team of powerlifters in Columbus very strong. Many of the things that he came up with via learning from the Russians largely have been validated and carried over into the realm of athletics, not just strength athletics, but all kind of athletics, MMA, football, basketball, you name it. There are things that Louie helped innovate that they're doing. So his philosophy mirrored very close these Russian texts. And one of those Russian texts was about the training of a gym or club in Russia called the Dynamo Barbell Club, who used the Conjugate sequence system, where they rotated through 60 to 80 different special exercises. Of course, with Conjugate, as I said, you're starting with an exercise that trains a weak point or you're weaker at and get stronger at that, and then work your way closer towards the competition lift and the specificity there. The theory being, okay, well, I tend to be weak in this portion of the lift, so now I'm focusing on lifting from that position, and if that gets stronger, then the rest of my full lift should get stronger too. So he's read about this, and he goes, okay, I'm going to start trying to incorporate this rather than just squatting once or twice a week, every week, squat, 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 squat. I'm going to start to rotate exercises. And while traditional Conjugate, you might rotate every few weeks or progress on it for a little while and then change, Louie said, okay, but I want to also do the maximum effort method. And that really beats you up. So he starts playing around with the frequency of how often he should change those maximum effort exercises, eventually settling on once a week. So every week he would rotate the maximum effort exercises. Of course, this is for powerlifting, not Olympic weightlifting. So that means squat, bench, and deadlift variations. So every week he would do a different variation. And when it came to squats, it would be either a variation of traditionally a box squat, because remember, he was influenced by Bill West and the original Westside Barbell, and they were big on box squats. So it would be a box squat. It might be a good morning, a deadlift variation, though those were done very infrequently, as Louie tended to believe they beat you up too much. And then on bench, it would be some variation of bench. It could be bench press, close grip, wide grip, floor press, incline, etc. Right? So he's changing these exercises on the maximum effort method. On a second day, he's doing the dynamic effort method, which is lightweight, moved very quickly for high velocities. And the volume of that day is higher, although it's done through high sets with low reps per set. After the main work, either the maximum effort or dynamic effort day, then he goes into a high volume of supplemental and accessory movements using the repetition method, which again, remember, is taking a submaximal weight to failure. So now what we see here is this concurrent system starting to lay out. You have a maximum effort day for lower body, a maximum effort day for upper body, a dynamic effort day for both of those, upper and lower. And then on all of those days, you're doing the repetition method, taking weights to failure. And that could be 5 to 7 reps. It could be 30 to 50 reps, whatever. So you're still getting the hypertrophy and endurance, all of those concurrent training concepts that we talked about at the very beginning. So that starts to evolve into the basic Westside setup. What Louie liked to say is 20% of their work was the main barbell lifts. The remaining 80 came from those supplemental and accessory movements. So that's a heavy emphasis on that would be called special exercises. So if a squat or a variation of a squat is the main movement, then those special exercises would be like a leg press, a belt squat, a leg extension, a leg curl, glute ham raises, back extensions, glute ham raises, reverse hypers, all these kinds of things. Those are all the special exercises. So the main volume of their work is built around those exercises to help build muscle and some non-specific strength. And then you turn that into specific strength by doing close variations of the main movement. So the basic setup in a week would be 1 day of maximum effort, lower body. The exercise, again, would change week to week. You could sit down and plan it out following a true conjugate system. You say, okay, if my main squat is a low bar back squat, I'm going to start with safety bar squats against chains or bands with accommodating resistance from a box. And then I'm going to work my way from there to a cambered bar, to a slightly lower box, and then I'm going to do a high bar pause squats, and then I'm going to do low bar squats to a box, then I'm going to finally do low bar squat. The idea is because I've gotten stronger from these harder variations, by the time I get to my main movement of a competition style squat, I'll be stronger on that as well. That's one way to do it. You could also just kind of choose on the fly, which seems to be what most of Louie and his lifters do. They would hang out in the morning and say, what do you guys feel like doing today? And we'll do that. Because what's more important in their view is that maximum effort output, that straining against a weight in the 90 to 100% range of a max. The second day would be another maximum effort day, but this is going to be for upper body. A day of rest, dynamic effort, lower body. So this is going to be that lighter weight moved for a high velocity, and you're going to do a fairly high volume through sets of low reps. So this would be traditionally something like 12 sets of 2 at maybe 55%. Now, Louie was really big on that accommodating resistance factor that I talked about earlier. So he recommended adding bands or chains to the bar so that it adds 25% at the top. So at the heaviest portion where that accommodating resistance is at its greatest. This is because he used a form of assistance gear in his competition that changed the strength curve so that it gave you a ton of support and rebound out of the bottom, but less as you went up through the range of motion and you had to do more and more of the work. This is called multiply powerlifting. I won't get into it. It's a whole almost separate sport, like comparing baseball to softball compared to raw powerlifting. However, because of that sport, that's where the accommodating resistance became very important because it neurologically trains a very similar strength curve to what a geared powerlifter would experience. If you're not a geared powerlifter, can you get benefit from dynamic effort training? Absolutely. The Russians proved this because you're just trying to increase rate of force development and you're taking many first rep sets, allowing you to really practice the technique as well. However, where the Westside wave was a 3-week wave that would go 55, 60, 65 or similar of 12 by 2, 10 by 2, 8 by 2, or 12, 12, 10, depending on which phase Westside was in their career. Bench was similar, but it'd be 9 by 3 all the time with the 25% accommodating resistance. You need to use a little bit heavier weight probably as someone who doesn't use the accommodating resistance and doesn't have that altered strength curve. In fact, when Westside Barbell first started, their wave would look something like 70% for 15 sets of 2, and this is low rest. So this isn't necessarily a long workout, mind you. We're talking like 30 seconds to a minute, probably on average 45 seconds in between sets. So 70% for 15 sets of 2. Then it might go the next week 75 for 12 sets of 2. Then 80 for 10 sets of 2. Then 85, 8 sets of 2, 90, 6 sets of 2, and you could keep going all the way up to hopefully setting a new max at 100, or you cycle back and wave back up. I've also seen some stuff where they would take it in 2.5% jump. So 70 for 15 by 2, 72 for 12, 75 for 10, 77 for 8, 80 for 6, 82 for 4, etc., etc. But the idea is you're kind of waving. It's called a pendulum wave, where you're starting at this lower intensity for a high volume, working your way up to a higher intensity for a lower volume. You might recognize this as the classic model for linear periodization. And so it's using that same concept. This is also kind of conjugate in that you're building a ton of work capacity at lower weights and working your way up to heavier weights at lower volumes. So that's their speed day. That's going to apply to both lower body and upper body. That emphasis is on squat and bench. Deadlifts, Again, Louie wasn't big on deadlifts, so he would just do singles and then focus on the accessory work. On every day, all 4 days, you're then going and doing a pretty high volume of accessory and supplemental work. This is going to be like 3 to 4 sets of anywhere from 5 to 20 reps of up to 6 exercises. So that's a pretty high amount of work, and you're moving pretty quickly. So that's like the basic kind of Westside Barbell powerlifting template or setup. There's a ton of different adaptations of this that you can read out there. Lots of different people have taken this idea and applied their version of it, and you can find most of them online. As with any training, as long as you apply it consistently, you adhere to the principles of specificity and overload, you will get stronger because you are also doing a high volume of special exercises. You will also build some muscle. Is it the best system of training? I don't know. I don't think any training system is necessarily the best system of training for everybody in every situation. However, it does work. It's worked for many thousands of lifters. And like any training program, you just need to find what changes you need to make it work for you. For instance, maybe you're not as technically savvy with some of your movements, in which case maybe you need to spend more than 1 week with them. Maybe you spend 3 weeks using them for your max effort so that you can get a little bit of technical mastery before you truly hit a max on that movement. But this brings us to the initial question. Can conjugate concurrent work for weightlifting? We have to remember that they're not the exact same thing. So can conjugate work for weightlifting? I would argue not only can it, it does, and most weightlifting programs use some kind of conjugation within their training. Yes, okay, the Bulgarians, maybe not, but most smart systems will use some variation of lifts that train a lifter's weakness to allow them to get stronger before then moving on to using the more specific version of the competition lift. I have heard even the Bulgarians, who are known for hyper specificity, would do some variations that would address their weaknesses, of course up to maxes and just heavy all the time. But it would be something like, if you're really weak from mid thigh, maybe they would do cleans from blocks or from hangs or something like that. I won't get too heavy into Bulgarian training. There's a lot of myths and crazy stories and probably lies. If you want more details, Max Ada is a great source. You can check out his stuff on YouTube. But my original point was most smart programs will use some form of conjugate. My own programs that I write for lifters will start a block with a lot of, say, high bar pause squats, and then work our way to a more specific, if they're a power lifter, competition style low bar squat. That's conjugation. So if you've done any variation in your weightlifting training, you're using conjugate. You can think of conjugate as like another fancy way of saying training your weaknesses, which is one of the keys to all strength training. You train your weaknesses to bring them up while practicing the movement that you need to do for competition, and that's really how you get stronger. So the initial question, does conjugate work for weightlifting? Yes, absolutely. Does concurrent work for weightlifting? Again, I would say I think most weightlifting programs do concurrent training to a degree, and they have for a long time, even before we had these concepts of like maximum effort, dynamic effort, etc. If you look at weightlifting programs 80 years ago, you had people doing stuff like during the week, 10 sets of 3 with a moderate weight. It sounds a little bit like dynamic effort, right? They would then have, say, a heavy Saturday or something like that, where they would work up to a max. Well, it's probably not a competition max, but a training max, but that's still a maximum effort method. If you do incorporate anything like that in your own training, where maybe you have a day where you're using 70% weight, hey, that's probably falling within the realm of dynamic effort. If you're using a little bit heavier in that 80% range, you're kind of falling now into the submaximal effort method, but still getting benefit because of the movement patterns that you're practicing. And then if you have any day where you go, let's work up heavy, 90% plus your max, that's really the maximum effort method. Not every training program does this, but many do. That seems to be very popular these days. If you're on more of kind of a block where you're like, okay, we're focusing on speed, we're focusing on hypertrophy, blah, blah, blah. Okay, you could argue that you don't, but most weightlifting training programs that I see don't really follow that. If you then follow your main work with any kind of accessory movement that's in the higher rep ranges, again, let's say 5 or 6 plus, that's hypertrophy. So you're still training speed, you're still training power. That's speed would be that 70% range, or let's say 60 to 70. Power would be that 75, 80 to 90, that kind of range. And then of course, maximum strength would be anything 90% plus. So you're hitting all of those different components really. Yeah, you may not be doing a ton of aerobic capacity training, but that's not really applicable to your sport if you're a weightlifter. So again, most programs probably do conjugate a little bit, and most programs probably are concurrent. That's being a little bit pedantic, because really what I know this lifter was asking is, does a Westside template work for weightlifting? So all of that preamble should give you enough information to come to your own conclusion. My conclusion is, sure, why couldn't it? You just have to make some changes to make it specific to weightlifting, because Louie spent 50 years adapting the knowledge he gained from weightlifting to apply it to powerlifting. So now you have to take the 50 years of adjusting a program to powerlifting to now adjust it a little bit back to weightlifting. Of course, they're very different movements. A snatch and a clean and jerk are nothing like a squat, a bench, or a deadlift. Those are actually less fatiguing movements because of how less complexity they have in their execution. Something like a clean and jerk is much more fatiguing than a bench press, for example, right? So you have to keep that in mind. But let's look at the basic setup of Westside and say, can we apply this to weightlifting? Can we have maximum effort attempts or specific days for weightlifting? Yeah, absolutely. Go in, do some variation of the snatch to a max. Boom, that's maximum effort method. Do the same thing with some variation of the clean or jerk, or clean and jerk, however your program couples those or uncouples them together. Maximum effort method. If you then do some secondary exercise to help support those movements, that's going to be working in that repetition method, like taking a weight to submaximal weight to failure, or the submaximal effort method, which is taking a submaximal weight not to failure, but practicing a movement pattern. So let's say it's your snatch day, you work up to a maximum effort hang power snatch. Then you're going to go and maybe do 4 sets of 4 of a drop snatch. Okay, boom, that's going to be a submaximal effort method. If you then go and you do some lateral raises to failure, or you then squat potentially to failure or something within a close proximity to failure, that's the repetition effort method. So you're already hitting those in your training block, so it's not that big of a leap. The dynamic effort method, you could easily take a day where you say, okay, I'm going to do a high volume of lifts, 65, 70, 75, etc., trying to focus on acceleration and moving the bar as quickly as possible. Now, weightlifting is already a dynamic sport. You can't really snatch slowly, right? You have to move it with some degree of explosion. But you can move it even faster at a light enough weight. If you wanted to get really fancy, you could attach some kind of velocity tracker, like a flex unit or whatever, and try to make sure that all of your weights are moving at a certain designated speed. And I think the original Westside dynamic effort method really would apply great in the context of weightlifting. 15 sets of 2, 12 sets of 2, 10 sets of 2, etc., working your way across some percentages and then waving back and doing that. That's a great way to do any kind of dynamic effort method, but especially in the context of weightlifting, because the complex nature of the movements don't really lend themselves to higher reps. So 2s are great. They're a perfect number to choose. And at those weights, it's light enough that you can really focus on force output. Where things get a little weird in trying to apply a Westside template to weightlifting is Westside is 2 lower body days, maximum effort and dynamic effort, and 2 upper body days, maximum effort and dynamic effort. Because snatching and clean and jerking are full body movements, how do you set this up? I think you could set it up very similarly. In fact, you don't even have to split them apart. You could have a maximum effort snatch and follow that up with dynamic effort clean and jerk, or clean or jerk or whatever. Or you can give them their own specific days. I think both can work and have worked. I've seen people do similar kind of setups. When it comes to your accessory movements, that's anything that isn't some variation of the main movement. And what I would consider a variation of the main movement would be, let's say, in any variation of a snatch, like hang snatch, power snatch, snatch from blocks, etc. But then special exercises like drop snatches or snatch balances or muscle snatches or those things, those would be your special exercises, in addition to squats and back extensions and reverse hypers and all these same kind of exercises that honestly Louie would have his lifters do for powerlifting. You could then even say, all right, let's conjugate this by starting each of your training blocks with the exercises that you're weaker at. So maybe you're really weak from that mid-thigh position, so you're going to start and do your max effort work from blocks that put the bar at the mid-thigh or something. Over time, you're going to slowly progress that through variations that you're weak at that progressively work you towards that main competition movement. The advantage is you're still doing the main competition movement on the dynamic effort day. So you're still practicing a lot of that main movement. The thing about all training programs is anything can work. You just have to manipulate it to work for you. So if this is something that a person was interested in trying, I absolutely think it could work. Now, I wouldn't necessarily call it Westside training because, I mean, it's a concept that Westside and Louie took from weightlifting and applied it to powerlifting. So really what you're just doing is a weightlifting program. Even if you wanted to attach bands and chains somehow on your poles or things like that, I still wouldn't necessarily call that a Westside program, because testing accommodating resistance with bands or by lifting in water or all kinds of crazy different ways are things that the Russians experimented with. So it's still just a weightlifting program. But if you're from America and you're coming into strength training with a very American perspective and a very powerlifting perspective, you might not know it as anything except Westside. So great, okay, fine. You're using a Westside template to train your weightlifting. But full circle, does Conjugate work for weightlifting? Absolutely. All weightlifting programs conjugate to some extent, in my opinion. Does Concurrent work for weightlifting? Absolutely. Most weightlifting programs probably use some degree of concurrent training. And then really what the question asks is, does Westside work for Olympic weightlifting? To which I say it absolutely can, as long as you're a little bit thoughtful about it. So I hope that gave a pretty clear understanding of the concepts of Conjugate and Concurrent, gave you a little bit of knowledge of Westside Barbell and Louie Simmons, who are very important for their contributions to the strength training community. And anyone who is interested in Olympic weightlifting, whether starting or is currently doing it, hopefully this will give you some idea of how maybe you can manipulate your own training if you coach yourself. Don't be so reactionary. People on the internet that are weightlifters love to be like, this is weightlifting, it's not powerlifting. Louie can go suck an egg. And I get it, but we don't need to react that way, okay? If you're lifting weights, you're already a weirdo and society thinks you're a freak. So let's stick together and learn from each other. Thank you for listening to the Verse Fitness Podcast. I've been your host, Shane Robert. If you want to find out more about Verse, you can check us out at verse.fit. Or if you have any questions, you can email them to podcast@verse.fit. We love to do Q&A episodes. If you have any general comments, feel free to leave them in the area below, or like, view, and subscribe.